So today we're going to be talking about Redis. The topic of today's talk is Redis for Magento developers. I already got a nice intro there, but just to go through it one more time, as mentioned, I'm the tech lead for one of our teams at Something Digital, the Strategic Engagement Group. We're a Magento Enterprise Solution Partner, and we are hiring, so come speak to me if that's something you're interested about. I'm a pretty active blogger. My blog is maxchadwick.xyz. I write about Magento. I write about technology. Go check it out. I think that the content is pretty good. And in 2017, I was recognized as one of the top 50 Magento contributors. So we're going to cover Redis, but what specifically are we going to cover? We're going to kind of go through three different sections. We're going to start out with some of the basics, just a definition of what Redis is, why you would use it, and just some basic information about how to use it. We'll go to a little bit more intermediate level stuff after that. We'll talk about configuration and security with Redis. And finally, we'll advance into what I would call expert level Redis topics, and we're going to be specifically speaking about performance there. Okay, so let's dive in. Starting out with the basics, what is Redis? So I pulled a definition that you will get on the home page of redis.io, which is the website with all the information about Redis, and I'll just read it to you. So Redis is an open source in-memory data structure store used as a database, cache, and message broker. So the first part to that, the first word about what Redis is open source. The entire source code is up on GitHub. This is the URL. You can go to check it out. You can dig in and actually see what's happening. It's written in C, like most of the tools that we use, like PHP or MySQL would be. And you can also contribute to it and look at issues and all that kind of stuff. And if you saw from the GitHub URL, it was under the username Antirez. So he is the author of Redis. And on the left, I have a screenshot of his website, antirez.com. It's a good place to check out for blogs and other information about Redis. And also, he's pretty active on Twitter. He tends to tweet a lot about Redis, so he's a good person to follow if you're on there to get updates about Redis. So that's kind of what Redis is. So why use it? So after open source, maybe one of the next things you saw in that definition is that it's in memory. And what this means is that it's super fast as opposed to other caching options like file system, which is reading off the disk. This is always reading directly out of memory, always, and that makes it really fast. Redis is not the only technology that is a full in-memory storage. So another popular one is memcached. However, there are several advantages to Redis as opposed to memcached. So just to list a few, on-disk save, which is helpful. Sometimes you'll actually want to take a backup of the Redis data, and you want to back it up to disk so you can pull it down locally and inspect and things like that. Redis supports that. Redis also has built-in support for replication, so a master-slave setup. And it has better eviction control with Redis. And these slides are actually on my website. I'll tweet a link to it after my talk, so you can follow me at maxpchadwick. But that word advantages is a link to a long list of advantages to Redis versus memcached. And finally, it's the most popular cache backend for Magento. And again, that word, or those words most popular are a link. They go to a poll that I had taken on Twitter asking people what they were using for cache storage. And Redis was, by and large, the winner. This was a while back, but this is only further evidenced if you look at something like Magento Cloud, where Redis is what they're using for cache storage. So that's why you would want to use it. How do you use it? So when you install Redis on your server, it will give you an executable, and it will be redis-CLI. It takes a few arguments, kind of similar to the MySQL executable, which lets you connect to the MySQL instance. So the -h flag will be used for specifying the host. This isn't necessary if it's running on the server that you're directly connected to, but if you're on a web server and you need to connect to another server that's running Redis, you would need this. And -p if you have it running on a non-standard port. The standard port is 6379, and it will default to that if you don't pass it, but you often do need to pass that. Once you're connected to it, you'll get a prompt kind of like you would get with MySQL. A useful command to run right off the bat is the info command. What this is going to do is it's going to print a bunch of human readable information. So you can see the Redis version, for example. You can get that at the info prompt. And there's a bunch of other stuff like information about how much data is currently in the Redis storage and some other stuff that's useful out of there too. Another common thing you'll probably need to do pretty early on with Redis is to flush it. So the way that this works is Redis has a kind of like MySQL has separate databases running on the MySQL instance. Redis also has a concept of separate databases. However, you don't name them. They're just given numerical indexes. 0 through 16 are the numbers that you get by default. And so what you want to do is you want to run this select command and give it the index for the database. And from that point on, all the commands you run will be against that database. And then you can run the flush db command, which will flush everything out of that database. A few things to be careful of right off the bat in terms of basic usage. One thing you might think that you want to do when you're connecting to Redis early on is to inspect the data that's in the Redis instance. And a command that you might find to help you do that is the keys command. And keys star will list all the data that's in the Redis instance. However, running this command can actually cause a service interruption and cause your site to go down for a little bit. And we'll talk about why that actually happens a little bit later in the talk. But suffice it to say, at this point, don't run that in production. And another one to be careful of is flush all. So I showed you how to flush a specific database. Flush all will flush all of the databases in the Redis instance. And the reason you don't want to do this is you may be intending to flush the cache, which is in one of your Redis databases. You may have session data in another Redis database, and flush all will flush those as well, which will kick users out who are currently logged in and all kinds of bad things like that. So those are kind of the basics. Going on to some intermediate stuff. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about configuration. And the specific area of configuration we're going to be talking about is memory management. You'll remember that Redis is entirely in memory. So with that in mind, managing the usage of memory of the Redis instance quickly becomes a very important topic when it comes to configuring Redis. So one of the first things to know about this is there's a setting for Redis called the MAXMEMORY. This is the maximum amount of memory that the Redis instance is allowed to use. It defaults to 0, which is infinite, basically. So if you don't set this, there's a possibility that Redis can basically grow indefinitely to the point where it consumes all the memory on your box. And what's going to happen at this point is that the Linux kernel is going to call the out-of-memory killer, and it's going to do something that you don't want, like kill the Redis instance, which will for sure bring your site down, or kill maybe another thing that's using a bunch of memory on your server, like your MySQL instance, which you don't want to happen either. So this is kind of one of the first things to know about configuring Redis is that you want to be setting the max memory. Once you have it set, it's really important to be monitoring the usage of memory because you're going to set it, but it's really hard to predict in advance the total amount of memory that the Redis instance is going to use, and it could change over time. So you want to have something in place to monitor the memory usage over time and something in place to send you an alert if it's gotten to a dangerous place. And a final tip here about memory management is actually to use separate Redis instances, and there are other benefits to this aside from just memory management. But from a memory management standpoint, what this allows you to do is actually tune that max memory for each type of thing that you have saved in the cache. So you can say, this is my max memory for sessions, this is my max memory for cache. If you're running Magento 1 still, this is my max memory for full page cache. So separate Redis instances give you much more kind of fine-tuned control over that. So how do you do this? So setting the max memory, you don't need to restart Redis to do this. You can do it at runtime. There's a config set command, and then you pass it a key value for the configuration option that you're going to set and the value you want to set it to. So with max memory, you set it in bytes. This will set it to 1 gigabyte, and then it will tell you OK, and it will set it and enforce that. That will not persist if the Redis instance restarts. So you additionally need to add that to the Redis configuration file. Here you can actually give the value in a human readable format, which is nice. So you can set it like this. Max memory is 1 gigabyte, and now you'll have set it immediately. And it will also continue to be enforced once you restart Redis. Once you've set it, as I said, the next thing to do is to monitor the memory usage. So at Something Digital, we use a New Relic plugin for this. It's a Redis plugin. I'll show you a little bit about it. But you do not need to use New Relic for this. There are other options. Basically, what this tool is doing under the hood is regularly calling that info command and extracting the used memory from it and sending it over to New Relic. Once you have that set up, you'll get a dashboard kind of like this. The thing that we're interested in here with monitoring memory is kind of in the lower middle, if you will, where it says memory use. That's tracking the memory use over time for this Redis instance that's being monitored. Once you have it set up, New Relic supports alerts. So what we've done here is we've basically defined a threshold, and if the memory usage goes above this, it's 400 megabytes. This is just an artificial example, but just to show you, it will then send an alert to an email so that we can go respond to that. We'll probably need to clear it at that point. Will be kind of our course of action, but we'll want to monitor that, and we may need to adjust it over time if we're finding that we don't have enough memory available. In terms of using separate Redis instances, so as I mentioned, one benefit to this is tuning the max memory per storage type. So by that I mean the cache, the sessions, and the full page cache. Reducing that flush all risk that we looked in the beginning. So you can say don't do it, but again, it ultimately comes down to human error potentially. If you have sessions in an actual separate Redis instance, even if somebody flush alls against the instance that's storing cache, the sessions still won't be impacted. So that's another benefit to it. And then a final benefit that you get to the multiple instances is multiple execution threads. And we're going to talk about what that means when we get into performance. So that's configuration. Diving into security. So this is one of my favorite pieces of writing about Redis security. It comes from that antirez.com blog that we looked at. But it's an article titled A Few Things About Redis Security. And Antirez basically walks through a scenario where an improperly secured Redis instance can be used to upload a public key to a server, and at that point you can basically just SSH in and completely own the box. So it's really important to configure your Redis instance securely. This is a post from my blog that, just to toot my own horn a little bit, I'd recommend you check out. But the Antirez post assumes that you can run commands from your remote location against the Redis instance. But what I'm talking about here is a server-side request vector. So basically what that means is that the request is originating from a web server that's actually already within the network, meaning that any firewall rules that you have in place wouldn't work at that point, would break down. And there's a lot more to that, so if this is interesting to you, I'd love to talk to you about it. So what to do about security? So again, network level security is obviously important with the Antirez thing. Make sure that you're blocking access to the Redis instance via a firewall so that only requests coming within trusted servers within your network can hit it. But you also should consider adding some authentication, a username and password. What this will do is, even in the case of a server-side request situation, the person sending that request would still need to know the username and password to issue a command against that Redis instance. Okay, so that takes us to the next level, which is the expert level. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about performance a bit here. So what I've done here is grab a few quotes from the redis.io site, and I'll just read them to you. So usually Redis processing time is extremely low in the sub-microsecond range. Sub-microsecond range. And another quote, it's good practice to use the ping program to quickly check latency between the client and the server hosts. So add these two together, and what you get is Redis is typically extremely fast at actually running the commands that you send to it. However, where you can get slowdown is if you have network issues between the client and the Redis server. So that's kind of one of the first things to keep in mind with Redis performance. And kind of building on that, this is some data that is from an example. I believe this is a Magento 1 site, but I'll show you some more data in the beginning. But Magento is actually very chatty with the Redis instance. You can see, this is from New Relic, and you can see 15% of the time on this site is spent sending hget commands to Redis, which is a total of 226 hget commands. So you can quickly see how just a small difference in the amount of time each of those commands take, which comes down to network, could quickly make the slow down your entire application. This is some more data. This is looking at Magento 2.1, Magento 2.2, and Magento 1.14. But what I wanted to show here is that that site is kind of in the middle. We have some Redis instances, some Magento instances that, like this 2.1, the second row down, it only does 141 commands. But we have other ones like the first 1.14 that does 492. So it's very typical for Magento to be very chatty with Redis. And if you look at that top row, that's pretty problematic. It's spending 2.37 milliseconds per hget command for a total of 600 milliseconds just issuing hgets to Redis. So you can see that's an example of where there's probably something going on at a network level. So Redis recommends using ping to measure the round trip time. We can do this just with the ping command. The C flag will be an account of time and then a number of times to run the command. And then at the bottom, it'll give you a summary. So you can see the quickest that this was 0.07 milliseconds. The average was 0.09 milliseconds, and 0.13 milliseconds was the longest it took to ping this host. Ping doesn't always work. Sometimes you run into firewall issues because it sends ICMP packets, which sometimes are blocked. You can use nping to send TCP packets. You can use Redis-CLI, which is a latency measurement tool that Redis actually gives you. The issue with this one is that you need to have Redis installed on the client, which isn't always the case. If you do see a network issue, you can use traceroute or TCP traceroute to get some diagnostics on how it's getting to the Redis instance, and maybe there's a load balance or something in between that's slowing things down so you can get the information there. A general guideline that I have is if the round trip time is more than 0.5 milliseconds, that I would consider a red flag. So in addition to network, threading becomes another issue with Redis performance. So this is another quote. Redis uses a mostly single-threaded design. And a consequence of being a single thread is that when a request is slow to serve, all other clients will wait for this request to be served. So basically, Redis can only do one thing at a time. If you issue a slow command to Redis, it's working on that. When another request comes and tries to talk to Redis, if it's busy with that, it's not serving those other requests. It's waiting for the thing that was slow. So that's a really important thing to understand about Redis. So what can you do about this? Redis gives you a SLOWLOG feature, which you can actually use to see what commands to that Redis instance are slow. So again, you can set this at runtime without restarting the Redis instance. This is a bit of a mouthful, but you use the SLOWLOG log slower than setting. And that is the threshold at which it will log to the SLOWLOG. You'll also need to set that in the configuration file in addition to at runtime. And once it's set, you can use the SLOWLOG get command, which gives you a few things. So what does SLOWLOG get gives you? It gives you a unique progressive identifier. So it's just an ID for the thing in the SLOWLOG, not that important. It gives you the timestamp at which it happened, how long it took for it to run, and an array composing the arguments of the command. So this is really helpful to see if things are slow, if things are getting backed up, if you see an error report in Magento that says it was a timeout waiting for the Redis connection, you can look at the SLOWLOG and see what was actually slow. So going back to these dangerous commands, keys star, the reason that command is dangerous is because when you do that, Redis has to parse it goes through every single key in the entire instance and spits it back to you, and it's blocking while it's doing that. So doing this, Redis is going to be really busy trying to do this, and other things are going to be waiting. This is why you see downtime. I mentioned that flush all is dangerous. FlushDB I've seen FlushDB be dangerous as well. So because it's slow to flush the database in some cases. So if you upgrade to Redis 4, there's actually a FlushDB async command that you can use that actually solves that issue. So what are some key takeaways? So first of all, understand the impact of in-memory storage. It's entirely in-memory, which means that you have to be managing the memory usage of the Redis instance on your box. It's very important for you to secure your Redis instance. An improperly secured Redis instance can lead to basically a complete takeover of the instant that's running on, and potentially your network and your site. Understand the importance of the network round-trip time with Redis. It's typically very fast to do things, but just a small difference in the amount of time it takes to talk to the instance can quickly kind of spiral out of control. And finally, understanding the single-threaded nature, the fact that Redis can only do one thing at a time, and if it does something slow, that other things are going to be blocked while that's happening. So I think I finished right on time because I just heard a bell. I will take any questions at this point.
All right, we've got a question right there in the back.
Hi.
Hey.
I was just wondering, is there any specific reason it's single-threaded? And if not, are there plans on the roadmap to make it multi-threaded?
That's a great question. To be honest, I don't know. I'm sure if there's probably GitHub issues about it on Redis, and there's probably blog posts and things like that. And I'm sure that Antiras has rationalized it, but I don't know exactly why. There could be some. If I had to guess, it's that there's some kind of like bootstrapping penalties for multiple threads. But I could be completely wrong about that. And that the idea is to keep it simple and to have that single thread. But I could be completely wrong. It's a great question. Unfortunately, I can't really answer it.
Anyone else?
How many concurrent connections to Redis would you allow in Magento config?
How many concurrent connections?
In Magento config, you usually set concurrency connections to Redis.
Okay.
By default, it's usually 6, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I haven't had to tune that setting outside of the default. We've run into Redis scaling issues, but it's never come down to that setting for me. So the default has always worked okay for me. But if you've tuned it, I'd be curious to talk to you afterwards about what the bottlenecks were that you hit it to and what you raised it and how that impacted things for you.
Okay, anybody else?
So one of the bottlenecks that you see often in MySQL is applications that are sort of chatty with the database for things like concurrent load like model loads and loops that will create excessive database load. Mm-hmm. When you see those Redis outliers that have very, very chatty instances of Magento, is it something similar to that that's causing it to be more chatty than, say, another more vanilla version of Magento? And what do you attribute that to? Is it third-party plugins or?
Yeah, it's probably plugins or custom code that are potentially in a loop accessing. Maybe they're not memoizing a configuration value that they need to access to perform some logic. And they're in a loop going through things, and they're fetching it from a call to get the Redis value each time, I would guess. I am interested in digging in and actually also looking at Magento core a little bit to understand why it's hitting Redis so much, but it's not. I haven't had time to dig into that too much at this point.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
What differences have you seen in implementing Redis from Magento 1 versus Magento 2, maybe lessons learned the hard way and how it's configured for those environments?
So with Magento 1, one of the things that we've seen, and this isn't a Redis thing as much as an application thing, is there's a bug in not a bug, but just inefficient code. Or I guess it's a bug. It's an issue that can happen when the config cache gets flushed, where basically like what's called a cache stampede happens at that point. And basically the cache gets cleared. It needs to resave it. But before it's able to resave it, another thing happens that prevents it from saving correctly. And it just kind of continues like that indefinitely. And there is a patch for that was, I have it on my blog, and it was created by Colin Mollenauer, who's the person who actually published the Redis cache backend for Magento. We've seen that on Magento 1. We haven't seen that on Magento 2. I'm not sure if it's fixed or not. But overall, I mean, in terms of the stuff that I talked about with performance, that stuff's going to be applicable in either case. In terms of just, the actual Redis process execution, it's kind of agnostic to the application code.